Hello, it's Jack. I'm back and you're back. So I went ahead and I did most of my eye makeup before shooting this video because I'm using a new palette that I haven't used before. I actually found out about it from my roommate. She found out about it from BuzzFeed. It's like a $13 eyeshadow palette and BuzzFeed raved about it. And I was like, all right, because I already have the Morphe rainbow, but then like that, I like having all my colors covered. Yeah, so since I hadn't used it before, I didn't know if it was gonna be like a lot of fallout, like how powdery it was gonna be. But I did my makeup first to get it out of the way, and to avoid. I also fucked with this a little bit too much because it was too big. I know you can fucking shine a spotlight on it. Anyway, so I feel so bad because I don't like doing too many of any one sort of video. So like I'm trying not to do too many video game videos. I'm trying not to do too many sad story videos, but I'm doing a sad story video. I can't help it. So, and I definitely didn't want to do it 2 weeks in a row because last week was Angel Melendez. But I could not get this story out of my head. I was thinking about this story last week when I decided to do the Club Kids instead. I could not get away from this story, no matter how hard I tried. And then when I finally caved and said, okay, I'll do the story, I was sad that I couldn't find more information about it. It's not a story that a lot of Americans have heard. It's a big deal in the UK though. And I had never heard of it until I watched this show on Netflix. It was originally on like UTV or something in England, the UK, I mean. But they have it, 3 seasons of it on Netflix, and it's called Murder Maps. It's a great little show. It's, I think 13 episodes total. I think it's season 1 and 3 have 4 episodes and season 2 has 5 because 2 of them are one story. And it uses maps. It uses images of maps to show where crimes were committed and how the perpetrators fled or didn't flee or how they acted afterwards. And it's all murders that happen across London. And they have like historians that talk about their antics. They have reenactors that do various things. So sometimes they have reenactors of the crime. This particular episode is actually a reenactment of a woman trying to get signatures for a petition on a train. And it was really interesting that the perspective that they used on that. So recommend the show. Complete side note, recommend the show. The case that I want to talk about though, and it's like, yeah, I should totally do this video the 2 days before Valentine's Day. I can't get this story out of my head. I cannot get Ruth Ellis out of my head. I don't know why I'm stuck on her. I don't know if it's because of the nightlife aspect of her, if it's the absolute horror that how her story went, because her story, had she been born or it happened 25, 50 years later, it would not have gone down like this. And it's just really, really heartwarming story, like I love. And the reason that she's famous in the UK, but not necessarily here, is that she is was the last woman to be executed in the UK. And of course, executions there, they hang you. Executions were done by hanging. So she was the last woman to be hanged in the UK. She was born in 1926, October 9th, 1926. Her father was a cellist, and her mother was half French, half Belgian, and she was a war refugee from the First World War. So they got married. They wound up having 6 children. The youngest one died. She was the 5th, so she had one sibling that was younger than her, but it was a brother, and he died. and her uncle died, and her dad just kind of lost it, and he spiraled into this alcoholic, abusive asshole. But he got a job in London as a chauffeur, and his new job came with a flat, like a free flat that came with it. So the family moves to London, and then everything just shortly before they moved to London, like a year before, Ruth Ellis had started working as a waitress at 14, because apparently that was legal back then in England. So she starts work as a waitress, and then they moved to London. And in 1943, so they move in 1941, in 1943, she meets a Canadian man. He's a soldier. His name is Claire Andrea McCallum. He's a Canadian soldier. And she falls hard. Now, I do want to add, while I'm thinking about it, that this story is not only about a murder, it's also got a whole lot of sad stuff in it. There's talk about child loss, miscarriage, domestic violence, abortion, more domestic violence. I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because it's like, it's so bad. This whole story is so bad. So if these are subjects that make you uncomfortable, you might want to. So she meets this Canadian guy, and she falls hard, and she gets pregnant. Claire talks about how much he loves her, and he asks her to marry him, and of course she says yes. She's crazy for this guy, and she says yes to marrying him, and she starts planning a life for them, for her and Claire and the baby. And she gives birth to the baby. It's a boy, and she names him Claire Andrea Nielsen. And she finds out that Claire McCallum, the soldier, is married with 3 kids at home. So she is now, obviously she can't marry him, so now she's an unwed mother. I'm pretty sure I read that she gave birth right before her 18th birthday. So she's a 18-year-old single mom, unmarried, in London in the 50s. And a lot of jobs back then would not hire you, or they would fire you if they found out that you were a woman who had a baby out of wedlock. So there weren't a lot of jobs that someone in this situation could do. But she was very pretty. Like, everyone thought she was very pretty, very glamorous. So she, after putzing around with some factory jobs, she got some modeling gigs. And then modeling gigs led to nude modeling gigs. And nude modeling gigs, it totally sounded like I said modeling. She managed to land a job as a nightclub hostess in London at a place called the Court Club. It was owned by Morris Conley. He owned a number of nightclubs in London. And nightclubs back then were very similar to now, but a nightclub back then in London was a place that you went to after the public houses, after the pub closed. So you would go to the pub first and get food and drink or whatever, and then when the pub closes, you go to a nightclub and you hang out and dance, and there's music and everything like that. And a hostess at a nightclub, in this particular sense, they were young women, late teens, early 20s, who they would get an allowance. Like, they could spend basically any amount of money on clothing so that they would look sharp and, attention getting. And their job was to flirt with men at the nightclub and get the men to spend money. And she was very good at her job. And this particular club owner, super classy, encouraged them to foster relationships with regulars, which basically means that she had to sleep with whoever Morris Conley told her to, including himself. But she was allowed to do work like that outside of what he said, so she could do her own transactions. So we're talking about very, very early on, sex is a business transaction for Ruth Ellis, which happens. So it really, when I say it was, I don't want to say it was on the verge of blackmail, but it was, if you worked for Morris Conley, you were fucking him. Like, it was straight up, you were gonna fuck him if you want to keep your job. So one of her regulars gets her pregnant. So this is not her second pregnancy. And she can't be a pregnant nightclub hostess. So she has an illegal abortion, because abortion was illegal in the UK at that time. Then she goes back to work. No problem, right? So at the court club, she met Morris Connolly through the camera club, and then she worked for the court club, and the court club is where she met her husband. She met a man named George Johnston Ellis. He was a dentist. He had already been divorced. He was recently divorced. He was much older than her. He was 41 years old, and he was an alcoholic. So they meet, they marry, and almost immediately George is convinced that she's having affairs, which, I mean, my personal opinion, how did you meet her? How did you meet her? You can't be mad at her for doing that work when that's how you met her. Whatever. So he is horrible. He's convinced that she's having affairs, and he starts knocking her around. He starts beating her. So this is now the second alcoholic, abusive man in her life, which they say it's a cycle. So she winds up pregnant from George Johnston Ellis, and this time she has a girl. She names her Georgina, and George refuses to acknowledge that he's the father. He is still convinced that she's having affairs and everything. So Georgina winds up being raised by a wealthy couple. George and Ruth agree for her to get raised by, and that information was really hard to find, because everything I found always talks about her son, Andy, that she had from the Canadian guy. Very few people ever talk about Georgina. But Georgina was raised by a wealthy couple. She had a good upbringing, mostly. And Ruth and George divorce very soon after. And then, so Ruth and Andy, her son, move in with her parents. And she goes back to being a prostitute to make income. Now, she still has her connection to Morris Conley. And Morris Conley needs a manageress for the little club in London. So she becomes the youngest, I think at 26, she becomes the youngest club manageress in London, which is a big deal. She was very good at her job. Very good at her job. She loved being the center of attention. She was lavished with gifts. She had celebrity friends. She was treated like a celebrity. And since then, ever since she got that job, even after her death, her life has been chronicled as though she were some sort of celebrity. So she was kind of okay with this. Like, she had a rough life to this point, and now she's somebody. She feels like she's somebody. And like I said, she makes a lot of celebrity friends. And one friend that she makes isn't actually really that important to the story. He's a race car driver named Mike Hawthorne. And through him, she meets other people in the race car circuit. One of whom is David Blakely. So she meets this David Blakely. And oh my God, you thought she fell hard for the Canadian guy. She falls even harder for this guy. Like, instant. He was engaged when she meets him, and within weeks he has moved into her apartment that she has above the club. They're, even though he's engaged, they're in a relationship. And during all of this, she also meets a man named Desmond Cousin. Now, Desmond Cousin flew bombers for the Royal Air Force in World War II, and he had become an accountant. And he and his family owned lots of tobacconist shops, and he took over the family business, so he was quite wealthy. And David Blakely was from a very wealthy family, so there's a lot of money swirling around and at this point in Ruth's life. And she winds up with both of them. She's dating both of them. She's sleeping with both of them. She agrees to be Cousin's mistress, but ultimately her life is about David Blakely. And her and David Blakely both have affairs this whole time. So, remember how I said David Blakely came from, so he comes from money. And his friends mostly come from money. The social circle that he is in is the same circle that his friends are in. And his friends all think she's very classless. She's working class. She works at a nightclub. Basically, everyone knows that she is kind of a prostitute. And even he is, from what I've read, even he was quite unacceptable to her at some point. I read somewhere that he had introduced her to one of his friends as the finest fuck in town. Not his girlfriend, the finest fuck in town. So all this is happening, and she's getting treated like garbage. And meanwhile, he's living in her apartment. He's spending all of his money on racing stuff. All his time and his money is on racing stuff. And he's relying on her for a place to live and money and everything. Now, that was that relationship. Desmond Cousin, on the other hand, was madly in love with Ruth Ellis. I mean, like fairy tale level in love with her. And he was trying to compete for her attention because she kept going back to fuckwad David Blakely. And meanwhile, he wanted to marry her. He wanted them to have their little happily ever after or whatever. And he sees David for who he is. He sees the relationship with David, and he sees how violent it is getting. David's hitting her, he's knocking her around, he's verbally abusive, he's physically abusive, because not all abuse is physical. And he wants to get her out. He genuinely does want to get her out. So the fights between Ruth Ellis and David Blakely keep ramping up and ramping up and ramping up and ramping up. And she's the center of attention at the little club. So when he comes to the little club to milk her for free drinks and everything like that, fights start. He would start a fight over any man who was looking at her funny or looking at her at all. And of course she was jealous about any woman he looked at. So it got to the point where their fights were costing Morris Conley money. The intake from the club like more than halved. And he was tired of it. He needs a manageress who's going to make him money, not one that's going to cost him money. So she loses her job and she loses the apartment. And this is the end of 1954. So we see that she's like 2 years she's been the hostess, or the manageress. So she moves in with Desmond Cousin, because of course he's waiting. He's like, hey, come on over. And he loves her. So he even allows her to sleep with Blakely in his house when they reconcile. Like he just wants to make her happy. And so Ruth Ellis wants nothing more than to be acknowledged by David Blakely's friends and his family. And she knows that her nightclub job isn't going to do that. So she starts doing things to try to make herself better. So she takes French lessons, and Desmond Cousin pays for some modeling classes. But the modeling classes don't work out very well because she's constantly, both the French teacher and the modeling teacher commented on how she's constantly covered in bruises. Black eyes, bruises, like constantly. So she doesn't really get many modeling gigs because what do you need a bruised up model, you know? And the fights with David Blakely are so violent that one day, I can't find a consistent month. Some people say January. I've seen January, February, and March. But during one of their fights, David Blakely punches her so hard that he causes her to miscarry. And it makes her ill. She's stuck in bed for like a month with a fever because it was just a bad miscarriage. And while all this is happening, Desmond Cousin gives Ruth Ellis a gun. He gives her a gun and teaches her how to use it. Now, if this case happened anytime within the last 20 years, why did he give her a gun? Like, did he know that she was going to retaliate from all the abuse? You know, she's being horribly abused, and even other club manageresses were saying, yeah, I have seen her get knocked around. But this is the 50s. So he gives her a gun, he teaches her how to use it, and she's feeling really ill after this miscarriage, and she snaps. She completely snaps, and she knows where there is a party. She knows that David Blakely is going to go to a party, and she knows where the party is. So she has Desmond drive her to where the party is with the gun that he gave her, that he taught her how to use. Let that sink in for a minute. Bought her a gun, taught her how to use it, drove her to go find David Blakely. So this is Easter Sunday that this happens. And she goes to the apartment where she knows that the party is happening. And Blakely goes to a nearby pub to get more beer for the party. And she takes a cab, she follows him. She lets him go inside the pub. When he comes out and he is fiddling with his keys at the car door is when she walks up and shoots him with the gun that Desmond gave her and taught her how to. And she fires 5 of the 6 shots into him. She holds the gun to her head and threatens to kill herself, but she can't pull the trigger. So she instead fires it off into a pavement, which the shot ricochets and she actually wound up injuring someone. So she killed Blakely, but also hurt somebody else. And there just happens to be a nearby off-duty police car there. So the cop arrests her and takes her in. And a lot of important questions weren't asked, and the ones who were asked weren't answered. So they don't really talk to a whole lot of witnesses, like the countless people who could vouch for the fact that Blakely was just wailing on her constantly. And trials back then were kind of a joke. They were a fucking joke. They were a completely fucking joke. And the differences between how things would have been done now and then done back then. So, you see a lot of times with these trials, with the women murderers, that they try to tone down their appearances and make them look more wholesome. They did try to do that with Ruth. Ruth, however, did not want roots showing. So she managed to convince the solicitor to let her get her hair bleached. And she dressed in like a sharp suit, a black suit with a white bright white blouse. That basically her lawyers thought made her look too slutty, but she was determined she was going to wear it. Desmond lied about giving her the gun. He lied about when he last saw her. He obviously didn't tell them that he drove her to where Blakely was. Because why would he do that? And really, there just wasn't much of a defense. And she's very honest about the fact that she went there to kill him. Very, very honest about it. And, you know, jury deliberations back then were not hours long like they are here now. So, like, witnesses weren't really put on the stands. Custon giving her the gun wasn't mentioned. The fact that Blakely had been beating her wasn't mentioned. She was brushed off as being hysterical and jealous. I think her defense even said that women can't help themselves when they're jealous or hysterical. And the jury deliberates for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. And Ruth is, of course, found guilty. And at this point, if you are found guilty of murder, you are automatically sentenced to death. So she's found guilty. She's sentenced to death. She's completely accepted it. She completely accepts it. She's like, what she tells a lot of people who ask her is that she wants to be with David again. And he's dead, so the only way to be with him again is if she is executed. Her defense, her solicitor mentions something about petitioning for a reprieval. She denies. She says that she doesn't want a reprieval. She doesn't want to be saved. She's on death row. David's dead, and she wants to be dead too. So she's found guilty. She's sentenced to death. And people freaked out. So by this point, and if you watch the show Murder Maps, you'll see the other cases that I'm referring to. At this point, there had been a couple of cases that had left a sour taste in people's mouths about the death penalty. Like there had been a couple people who were wrongly executed. And people, even who were for the death penalty, weren't super keen when women were executed. Like they just didn't, people generally did not like when a woman was hanged. And there was a story that happened, actually the season before, with Edith Jessie Thompson. I can do that in another video, but she is wrongfully hanged and she's a woman. So these instances just keep stacking up and stacking up. So there are literally petitions going out all over the world to spare her. Not to throw out her sentence or anything or hear any evidence, just to not hang her. And people wrote the Home Secretary, like multiple people wrote the Home Secretary. The judge wrote the Home Secretary. The prosecutor wrote like, even the people responsible for convicting her were trying to get it all done. And there was just a lot of unease, and the practice was eventually stopped a decade later. So poor Ruth, she was hanged on July 13th, 1955. And this is where, I mean, the case is a doozy. I didn't realize how much of it else was a doozy. So the fallout from this case was ridiculous. So I'm just gonna rattle off what happened after she died. So the custom at that point was all of the women who were executed in a given year would be buried in an unmarked grave together. So she was buried in an unmarked grave. In the 70s, like 15 years later, all of the women in that grave were dug up and they were given proper graves with stones and everything like that. So she's exhumed and reburied, and the name on her gravestone was Ruth Hornby, because that was her dad's actual name before he changed it to a stage name. Her son, Andy, Jesus Christmas, wound up in his lifetime suffering from schizophrenia and drug abuse. He found her headstone, he found her grave, he found her headstone, destroyed the headstone, went back to the little apartment that he was renting and hanged himself, killed himself. And that was in 1982. So she was executed in 55. In 82, he found her gravestone, destroyed it, and killed himself. Her ex-husband, George Ellis, somehow it was possible to descend further into alcoholism, and he did, and he killed himself in 1958 by hanging. Her daughter Georgina, because her husband was dead, Georgina was an orphan, so she remained with the wealthy family, and they wound up fostering her. So the story is so sad. Her mother, Ruth Ellis's mother, and I can't find anyone saying for sure whether they think this was intentional or if it was an accident, but they found her mother in her house at the time in one of the rooms with a gas leak. There was gas leaking into the room, and she was unconscious, and she never fully recovered, and she never spoke properly again. And she died they found her in 69 in a room filled with gas. The room filled with gas, and then she wound up dying soon after. Georgina, after being fostered by the wealthy couple, she wound up having a modeling career after all of this. This was so hard to find about Georgina, but she died of cancer at age 50. So in 2002, she died of cancer. Her solicitor, John Bigford, died alone and an alcoholic. Oh, he never forgave himself that he didn't do more to save her. Like, there was actually a surprising amount of regret on the parts of the men who put her away. And this is the one. I don't want to say that it's Schadenfreude because it's horrible, but Desmond Cousin moved to Australia. When did he move to Australia? I couldn't find what year he moved to Australia, but he died in 1991 because he suffered a fall in his home, resulting in a fracture dislocation of his neck, and he wound up dying of pneumonia and organ failure. This story is so disgusting to me. Like, I can believe it. Trust me, I can believe it. But at the same time, I can't believe that, like, there were so many chances for them to ask about the gun. And fuck Desmond for lying to them and never telling them. I mean, I think he admitted it like 10 years later that he had lied and that she had lied. Because Ruth refused to tell anyone that she got the gun from Desmond Cousin. She didn't want to drag him into it. And he gave her a gun. Taught her how to use it, drove her to find David Blakely, and then lied and told everyone he hadn't seen her. And she covered for him. because of course she covered for him. That's what happened. She always made excuses for the men in her life because the cycle, the alcoholic abusive cycle is really, 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 really sad. And she was young. Now, being last week, I talked about how Andre Melendez had hopes and dreams. I don't know if she had hopes and dreams. I really don't know. I just know that she had a really rough life. Oh God, please don't fuck up my makeup. She had a horrible, horrible life. Surrounded by alcoholic men who didn't give a fuck about her. There we go. Surrounded by, and it's just really sad. And like I said, how different could that have gone had anyone given a fuck, had anyone stepped in, had anyone defended her, had it happened any other time? Like, how much of it was her? It's just really, really sad. Oh, it's really, really sad. And I like last week, I don't have anything to add. Oh, that was way too much concealer. I don't have anything to add. I don't know what could have made the situation better. I don't know. I don't know. It's so sad. And her poor children. Like, her son wound up with suffering with schizophrenia, and I'm trying to wonder what mental space that you're in to go to your mother's gravestone and destroy it. Like, why? Was he angry at her? Was he frustrated? It's just really, really sad. And I hate saying really, really, but it's just really, really, really sad. I don't know if I could do another sad story like this another week in a row, but I could not. I think part of what I feel for her is I feel that for how invaluable she felt. Like that, I think that's what drives me the most, is all she wanted was this one person to acknowledge her, and she was just a pawn in all these people's lives, a prop, a punching, like, I don't want to say a punching bag, that's awful, but so that's the story of Ruth Ellis. I will admit I feel a little bit better. I feel like a little bit of weight off my shoulders getting the story out. I don't know. I do hope you check out the Murder Maps series that I was telling you about. It's a really good show. I really like it. I enjoy it. And I am going to try to come up with a happy video to do next week. I'm going to try. So if there's anything you can think of, I want to know what you want to know. So if there's something you want to know about, comment it below or message me or something. I'm just kind of awkwardly rambling at this point. So I will see you next week. I hope you have a good day. I hope you have a good Valentine's Day. I hope you rock all of it. And I will see you when I see you.